parametric EQs, one of my favorite topics, and one around which there's a ton of confusion and a ton of misconceptions regarding how many bands you need and how many bands you might not need, etc., etc., etc. So I thought it would be fun to take a look at a real-world tune. This is the tune file that I use in my Cadillac, my personal car. And this is a car that's got a pretty serious audio system in it. It has C7 three-ways up front, left and right. And it has one of our Marine Infinite baffle subwoofers in the rear deck and two of our new VXI amplifiers. So this is the project file from the 8-channel VXI, and I'm going to share with you the equalization that was done in this car. This car was at Knowledge Fest just a couple of weeks ago. I'm recording this in March of 2018, and it was very well received. A lot of people listened to it. It's a pretty serious tune, a lot of care, a lot of time went into it, and the result was pretty darn good. The car sounds really nice, and this is a one-seat tune I'm going to show you. This happens to be the passenger side tune. This is the one everybody listened to at the show because I was demoing it from the driver's seat. And the EQs are therefore different from left to right, so I can show you that. This is the setup screen in which you can see that the inputs that I'm using are optical digital inputs from the NavTV OEM interface that's in the car. And these simply feed all of the separate equalizers. There's a pair of equalizers set up for the tweeters, a pair of equalizers set up for the mids, a pair of equalizers set up for the mid-bass drivers. You can see this one's not connected. That's for a center speaker that is not in use in this particular preset. And there's also an EQ for the rear speakers, which are run in mono in the car. I won't get into that one too much. I think it's got one band of EQ on it anyway. And then it has a pair of preamp outputs that are fed through yet another pair of EQs. So this particular amplifier gives you 10 channels of 10 band parametric equalization that you can apply, and I'm using 9 of them in this particular tune, so I have access to 90 bands of parametric EQ to tune this car the way it's configured. This is how a lot of active systems are configured, with one EQ per output, so this is a pretty good real-world example. Let's move on to the Tune tab of the software and take a look at some actual EQs. This is the output to the subwoofers. As you can see, I use 2 bands of equalization to create a slightly complex response here, as opposed to just doing one cut. So a couple of bands were used on the subwoofer here. Now let's move up to the mid-bass drivers. This would be channel 6, the right mid-bass speakers. 2 bands of parametric EQ were set up, one at 330 Hertz to deal with a resonance problem, and another one at 105 Hertz, 6 dB cut with a moderate Q. And let's move on to the mid-range channel on that side. Ooh, this is a pretty severe EQ going on here. Well, the mid-ranges in this car are mounted in the dash locations, which are up in the corner of the dash and corner loaded with the windshield, which creates some really interesting acoustical effects, like a massive peak in response around 1.5 kilohertz. Actually, yep, 1.5 kilohertz, as you can see right here. With the parametric EQ, I'm able to zero in on that and really create a steep, narrow cut in that region, while also shaping the upper end of that cut with another band here at 2200, and with this band and this band. These 4 bands here are all that I'm using to EQ this complex response that spans pretty much across the entire pass band of the mid-range. I don't need to use 8 bands, 9 bands, 10 bands, 20 bands, or 30 bands. It's 4 bands. But the fact that they're interacting with one another to create this complex response shape is what makes a parametric so powerful. I could take one of these bands, this one in particular that I just highlighted, and temporarily defeat it. And you can see the change in response that occurs across the entire range just by removing that band from the equation. If I wanted to, I could also adjust that band, and look at how I'm lifting and cutting the entire range, right? Let me put that back with my handy undo function to the way it was before. Okay, so that's the mid-range, which is probably the most complex speaker to EQ in the car, and maybe the most critical too, because that's where our hearing is most sensitive, and you really have to get it right to get the vocals right and everything else, and the imaging. Finally, let's look at the tweeters. I'm using 3 bands to just create a kind of shape to lift the top end of the tweeter. They're pretty off axis in the car, and this is the right tweeter, so I'm lifting the top end a little bit on the right side to help out with the brilliance on the top end of the tweeter, and then a couple of little cuts there to deal with acoustical issues, because again the tweeters are near the glass and everything else. So if we go backwards and count here, I have 3 bands on the tweeter, I have 4 bands on the mid-range, that's 7. I have a couple of bands on the mid-bass, so that's 9. And then if we add the sub, there's 2 bands. That's 11 bands total, right? Just to do one side of the car. Out of, what did I say, how many did I have available in this particular application? I have 90 bands of EQ available in this particular amplifier if I use all the channels of equalization. So it's a very powerful feature to have, the ability to go full parametric with an EQ. Now in another video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that you have to use a little bit different approach, well, a lot different approach actually, to using a parametric. The number one reason people get frustrated with parametrics is that they try to use them like graphic EQs. And you can't use a parametric like a graphic. You can't think the same way. You kind of have to turn it upside down. And once you figure that out, it's like riding a bike. Okay, you figure it out and you never want to go back to the tricycle ever again. So look for that other video in which I'll explain how to approach tuning with a parametric. I hope this was informational.